Sometimes you only need to kick your feet up and enjoy a little downtime. That is, if you're not in charge of a tiny kingdom threatened by an invasion, or not facing dire choices such as whether you approve of your daughter's new pet hedgehog. This is the setup of Yes Your Grace, the 2020 kingdom management game from Brave at Night. Okay, it's also a part-time dad simulator, but it would sound very weird if I opened up with this qualifier. This quaint-looking indie title puts you in the shoes of King Eric and his rule over the fictional kingdom of Darwin. Your task is to maintain your domain as well as you can while addressing your subjects' requests. You have to do this while your reign goes through a series of existential threats and all the drama that goes hand in hand with it. This starts with the news of barbarian attacks against random villages, which King Eric initially discounts as nothing special. All changes when one of the captured barbarians is interrogated. While questioned about the motives of their presence, he mentions a promise that must be fulfilled. In a panic, Eric rushes to his dear wife Aurelia to break the dire news. 13 years prior, the two were captured by bandits while traveling the countryside. With a knife at her throat, the then young prince was made to promise the hand of his firstborn daughter in exchange for their lives and freedom. At that time, this commitment seemed impossible to ever come up, so it didn't seem that bad of an idea if it meant they could escape with their lives. Even so, what can they do? After all, they're just barbarians. There can't be more than a few scattered bands of warriors, right? Well, it just so happens that Bayran brought a massive army with him. Okay, but at least the kingdom's strong enough to fend them off, and Darwin's army is practically non-existent. The coffers are empty, and everything is in serious disrepair. The only remaining option is to forge an alliance with King Talus and hope he'll lend you his impressive army to make the problem disappear. He seems uninterested in the situation but agrees to help you on one significant condition: that his son Ivo marries Eric's eldest daughter. In an ironic twist of fate, Lord Sulia will end up married away despite her father's efforts to prevent that. But in these conditions, it still seems better for her to marry another prince than a barbarian warlord. Heartbroken but relieved, the king agrees, and a big wedding is organized to celebrate the union. Even if his daughter is going to leave, at least the barbarian threat is gone with the help of King Talus's army. His troops will make the crisis seem trivial, so the time for worries is finally gone. And then King Talus dies after drinking a poisoned cup of wine. No, this isn't going to be that kind of story, isn't it? Before carrying on with the rest of the game, a reminder that you can support this channel on Patreon. If you weren't depressed already, my subtle plug will surely finish the job. At this stage, the game opens up its mechanics as you rush to mount up a defense against Bayran's armies. This is as good a moment as any to discuss what you can do in Yes Your Grace. First and foremost, you take audiences in the throne room. Most of the time, your subjects require assistance with various problems. This can vary from crops ruined by flooding to property disputes, diseases, and so on. In some cases, you can give gold or supplies as a way to solve them, while in others, the presence of one of your agents is required. You can always choose whether to help them or not, which is usually based on the resources you have at your disposal. That's because more often than not, your coffers aren't plentiful and you have expenses of your own. Your army needs feeding, the people you employ need to be paid, and the castle upgrades require a lot of investments from you. But the game actively encourages you to get out of your comfort zone. You never know how generous your subjects can be in their gratitude after you help them out. No, I mean it in the literal sense, you really don't. That's because one of the game's biggest strengths is how it puts you in situations where you must make meaningful decisions while giving you only scraps of information to work with. Sometimes the poor peasant you helped find a cure for his sick kid will provide you with a few supplies they can scrounge up. In other cases, the tradesman who wanted to open a new business with you was just stringing you along. And sometimes the village you helped out rewards you very well for what you did. There are some clues here and there, but in the end you have to discover on your own the veracity of your subjects' claims after deciding to help them out. Blind trust is explicitly discouraged from the start, but you rarely know someone's trying to trick you until it's too late to do anything about it. I like that such simple decisions are made much more difficult with this subtle approach. After King Talos' death, his son is unwilling to fulfill his end of the agreement, so you're forced to look elsewhere for allies. This is done with the help of your carrier pigeon, which you can send once per week to summon various nobles and other important people from your realm. Each can provide you with different amounts of money, supplies and troops on conditions of doing them a favor. These take form of small quests involving interacting with other nobles or acquiring special items most of the time. Just like your regular subjects are unknown variables, so are the powerful nobles as well. Their motives are not straightforward and neither is their honesty, so it should not be a surprise to learn that these are equally challenging to weave through and exciting to experience. A third component of your kingdom's management consists of your special agent. Initially, it's just your general, but as the game progresses, you get access to a hunter and a witch to aid your efforts. Both your subjects and the noble lords sometimes demand the intervention of a specific agent for specific tasks. In some cases, this is the only way to solve a request, but you can get to use them primarily by sending each to various locations within your kingdom. On their return, they'll report solving all sorts of problems they encountered at their destination and hand you the gold or supplies they managed to bring up on the way. Here, the strength of the decision mixed with the lack of information is gone completely. Indeed, you rarely know what is waiting for your agents at their destination, but when the only choice is which random location you click on the map, the magic of the system's duality falls entirely. To add insult to injury, which agent you sent to a site is irrelevant to the outcome. They will almost always report their success and reward you with some resources. Only rarely will there be a follow-up or anything particular to make a difference. It's a big missed opportunity, mainly since the main story uses the agent's specialty, so it's not like the developers were unaware of how to use them. The only plausible explanation I can find is that having to guess which agent is good for each destination would have spiked the difficulty considerably. After all, you only have a limited number of weeks until the big battle, so wasting your agent's actions could weigh heavily on the game's economy. But all these things only make up for half of the game. The rest is dedicated to the game's world building, character development and storytelling. At the start of the video, I said that yes, Your Grace is partially a dad simulator, but it was not entirely a joke. Much of King Eric's inner turmoil revolves around protecting his family, and much attention is focused on his relationship with his three daughters. Lorsulia, the eldest, starts the game as cold and distant. It's unclear what's going on, but after some prodding, she tells her father that she fears that she's gonna be married away. His second daughter, Asalia, is much more fascinated to learn how to fight and cause mischief than acting as what's expected from a princess. The youngest, Sedani, suffers greatly after Lorsulia's departure and deals with this loss in ways that make sense for a child her age. I can't relate to all these dynamics since I'm not a father. Still, despite the cliché-istic template each daughter falls into, it's quickly evident that there's a lot of warmth to be found in these interactions. It contrasts nicely with what's essentially a rather bleak and hopeless setting. Each character is interesting in their own way, and each member of Eric's family has a lot of personality to make them stand out. King Eric is put in a desperate situation time and time again. Rays of hope briefly shine, only for events out of his control to make things worse than they were before. After the death of King Talos, his son Ivo accuses Eric of the crime. This prompts an entire investigation, at which point the most likely culprit is executed and the alliance is finally secured. In the meantime, Lorsulia's letters regarding her life with her new husband are more and more disturbing, and her well-being seemingly decreasingly safe. King Eric has no choice but not to act on his suspicions, since the survival of his entire kingdom rests on the troops Ivo can send. What follows is falling into spoiler territory, I have to warn you. It may just be a 6-hour game, but just in case. Well, if you suspected Ivo's troops will not come to the battle, congratulations! King Eric lost almost all of his and his allies' armies, but managed to fend off the barbarians by the skin of his teeth. The betrayal stings, but at least the kingdom is safe and a massive weight is lifted off Eric's shoulders. That weight is smashed back into place shortly after, with Ivo declaring the trial a sham and the victorious battle against the barbarians a manifestation of witchcraft that must be purged. Oh, I forgot to mention that he became a religious witch-burning zealot, such a small detail to forget. From here on, your efforts revolve around rebuilding an army to face this new threat, but since your nobles gave you all they could already, you're stuck with conscripting the peasants to make up a small defense force. The situation looks pretty dire considering Ivo has a very sizable army. To make matters even worse, news of Lorsulia being burnt at the stake on accusations of being a witch and a traitor arrives and sets up a dark ending to the story. You might notice that, unlike the gameplay, I talked about the story's beats as constants instead of variables. That's because the main story doesn't deviate much despite having dialogue options with some degree of choice. Indeed, there are multiple endings and the fate of the main characters can change depending on what you choose to do. But the essence of the story remains the same. Complaining about this would be easy, but it's not a fair critique. Not every game needs a branching choice system, and choices aren't necessarily the core pillar of a story's writing. Yes, Your Grace is, at the end of the day, a historical fantasy game. Fictional kingdoms, characters, people and cultures, and it goes as far as using gibberish sounds for the character's speech. As a mandatory tangent, I was really impressed with how much character and personality the voice acting had, by the way. You wouldn't think that mumbling and grunting can be used to evoke emotions as well as they do here.
Oi, Kaba. Kwa. Rawa. Wata. Oi. Kaba oi.
Endo. Ulas.
Baboya. Buddha Koi. Akizai.
And yet, despite its fictional nature, it's presented with a lot of respect towards real-life medieval history. You might already guess where this is going. I dedicated a lot of time to the topic of historical accuracy when I talked about Kingdom Come Deliverance and Pentiment, each having its own distinct approaches to achieve that. Kingdom Come took a real-life war and some prominent characters and placed them into a well-documented portrayal of 15th century Bohemian society for the player to immerse himself in. On the other hand, Pentiment had a much more academic approach by reimagining a slice of 16th century Bavarian rural life to create a murder mystery deeply engorged in the intellectual and artistic reality of the time. It must be strange to hear that a story that has nothing anchored in reality can be historically accurate. Instead, Yes, Your Grace does make a very honorable effort in that sense. Is its writing as ambitious or exhaustive as either Kingdom Come or Pentiment? No, of course not. This is a 6-hour indie game, don't be silly. But I give Caesar what he's due regardless. First and foremost, the king's role in society is presented with a welcoming amount of nuance. His audiences were so important because one of his functions was to settle legal disputes. Remember, we're in a medieval setting, long before concepts like separation of power and independent courts existed as we understand them today. Sentences were at the king's discretion, so any semblance of consistency was quickly forgotten, but still, the king's justice was the law, and the people looked up to it. Another interesting note is how the subjects relate to his power. King Eric is not a powerful figure by any means, and it shows. In the late game, villages that were not helped by you in the past simply refused your call to arms. Some do so because another noble or monarch provided the support they needed. Those thinking that the medieval monarch had absolute power over his subjects will be surprised that such insubordination isn't quickly followed by accusations of treason and public executions. But the reality was that most kings did not have such a discretionary power over most of their own subjects, especially if their authority was hanging by a small thread. After all, a king that's deposed is not going to come back to get his revenge. Magic is a prominent topic in Yes Your Grace, and most of the time it's mentioned as something real and palpable. This extends to the king himself, or more specifically, his touch. In one audience, a villager complains about a skin disease and demands to be left to touch his majesty to cure himself. This seemingly strange request is a real-life phenomenon known as the royal touch that existed throughout the Middle Ages. The perception of the king's touch having healing properties was so widespread that it even became part of the coronation process. Labeling this behavior as superstition would be easy, but it has a more profound implication. Remember that all kings are anointed when they're coronated, meaning that they are the vessel of God himself in the material world. This in turn means that, at least by association, they share properties with the most famous of God's vessels, Jesus, who, as we know, was known as capable of miraculously healing the afflicted with just a simple touch. So, because of that, the royal touch became a ritualistic necessity to reinforce the divine attributes of the monarch. I have to say that I was positively surprised seeing this piece of history referenced the way it was, and I'm also very glad it gave me an opportunity to commit blasphemy in front of at least a couple of Christian denominations. That being said, I have to wrap around and continue my criticism regarding gameplay. At this second stage of the game, because noblemen have no armies to give you, the ordinary people have to provide manpower. The way this is achieved is yet another missed opportunity. Settlements you helped in the past will now pledge 6 soldiers each after you send an agent their way. And that's kind of it. Each day you get to send agents to 3 different villages, and the end result is the same minus a few exceptions. There's not even a variety of outcomes, so you can just blindly send your agents far and wide randomly. Consequently, this entire segment is tedious and your input is becoming less and less important. This is partly due to the resource balance that makes things way too easy to handle. Without putting any special effort into it, I could afford every castle upgrade despite the game making it seem like a titanic undertaking. While at the beginning of the game I was forced into being careful with whom I gave out resources, by the end you have so many that it becomes nearly impossible to not afford to help out a settlement. This in turn kills off the great dynamic I mentioned before, since your decision making becomes irrelevant. Maybe I got lucky and hit the golden path of small choices that allowed an optimal resource generation process, but I doubt I had anything to do with it. This in turn kills off the tension and the mood the storyline went through such efforts to set up. My initial impression was that I was about to see season 1 of Game of Thrones from the perspective of Eddard Stark, with bleak premises culminating into veritable nightmare scenarios for the protagonist and his family. But the very dark moments of the story are juxtaposed with light-hearted interactions and very forgiving gameplay. I'm not saying that a good story needs King Eric to watch his whole family die horribly, but it does feel like the writers took a peek into a dark alternative and got too scared to use it. That being said, the gameplay's low difficulty isn't the end of the world. After all, Yes Your Grace has created a compelling world with intriguing characters. The tonal inconsistencies don't take away from this achievement. It's worth a playthrough because how often do you witness a fake Slav setting after all? What, you thought that these fictional names were a coincidence? You're not fooling me by making your studio in Manchester. I can spot a Polish name from a mile away. Into the playlist it goes. Thanks to everyone for watching this video. Click the things, support the channel, and share this with your like-minded fellows. And until next time, cheers!